It's July the 28th, 2021, Atlanta, Georgia in the United States. A woman goes to meet her partner from work late at night, but at that moment the partner is unable to leave work, so they agree that they will meet up again later. But they will never see one another again. The woman goes off to a local park which she knows really well to walk the dog that they own together. But when she enters the park, she is brutally murdered. Her dog is also killed. Whatever happened to Katie Janness and her dog Bowie? Katie Janness, or Katie as she was usually known, was a 40-year-old lady who lived with her partner Emma Clark in the Piedmont Park area of Atlanta, Georgia in the United States. The pair of them owned a dog, a pit bull terrier called Bowie, who was basically like their little baby. The two of them had been together for approximately 7 years, and outsiders would say that both Katie and Emma were committed to one another. They weren't actually married, but they considered themselves so, and they got along famously most of the time, albeit with a couple of little spats here and there, which I guess most couples do have. Everyone that knew Katie, including her partner Emma, would say that Katie was really bright and also very, very creative. She had recently taken up learning the guitar, and not only was she learning to play the guitar, she was trying to write her own songs with it. She read an awful lot, and she loved to walk, especially with their dog Bowie, quite often in the local park. Katie worked as a bartender in one of the local restaurants. It was an Italian restaurant called Campagnolo. But on the night we're going to talk about, 28th of July 2021, she was not working. Now, quite late on in the evening, around about 10 p.m, Katie went to visit Emma Clark's place of work, hopefully to walk home together. Katie had Bowie, their dog, with her. Now, for one reason or another, I think work-related, Emma wasn't allowed or able to leave work at that particular time. So the two of them agreed that Katie would go off and walk Bowie in a local park where she'd been many, many times. She was very, very familiar with the area. After walking Bowie, Katie would return to Emma's place of work, where again they would meet up and walk home together. Katie set off to walk Bowie along 10th Street towards Piedmont Park. It was a route she'd taken many, many times, and she felt comfortable in the area. It was known to be fairly safe. But when she said goodbye to Emma, sadly that would be the last time that Emma would see Katie and Bowie alive. We know from a subsequent investigation that Katie did indeed walk along 10th Street. She was picked up on a security camera. Now, this security camera caught her and Bowie crossing the street at 10th and Piedmont. She was crossing a very distinctive rainbow-painted crossing. She was seen to be wearing a black shirt with a colourful motif on it, and blue jeans and sneakers, so it was definitely her that was identified by the camera. And Bowie was seen to be walking by her side on a leash. As the evening wore on to about 1 a.m, Emma Clark finished her work, so she texted Katie to let her know this. However, she received no response to her text, which she found highly unusual because Katie always responded. So she texted her again, and again, and again, but all of her texts went unanswered. Now, I don't profess to be an expert on mobile phones, but I believe on some phones, especially when you have a partner, it's possible to set them up so you can track one another's location. And this was the case between Katie and Emma. Emma used her own phone to track the location of Katie's and found that she was just inside the entrance of Piedmont Park. But the strange thing was, despite taking Bowie for a walk, Katie was not moving. By this stage, Emma was quite concerned, so she went off to find Katie. She went along 10th Street towards the entrance to Piedmont Park that she thought Katie was located at from the tracking on her phone. It was the entrance at 10th Street and Charles Allen Drive. When Emma entered the park and saw Bowie's horribly mutilated dead body, she was naturally extremely upset. She was initially in a dilemma whether to stay with him and call the police, or go further into the dark park looking for her partner. She decided to look for Katie and was completely devastated when she found her lifeless body. It was a totally horrific scene, one that would be etched on her memory for the rest of her life. She would later state that she lost both the love of her life and her baby boy that terrible night. She immediately called 911 and informed them of what she'd found, and police were very soon on the scene. Both Katie and Bowie were pronounced dead at the scene when paramedics arrived and examined them. And because of the nature of their injuries, the police immediately deemed it a violent homicide. They cordoned off the area and started an immediate homicide or murder investigation. Now, I'll go into the details of what the investigation threw up in terms of Katie and Bowie's movements in just a moment. But first of all, I'm going to gently lead you through the harrowing details of what had happened to them both. Katie Janness and Bowie both underwent autopsies. And looking at Katie's injuries first of all, they were horrendous. It was determined that she had suffered no less than 50 stab wounds to her head, arms and torso. At least 15 of these wounds were concentrated around the head area. It was also reported that she had an LGBTQ tattoo and that some of them were concentrated on that, but I can't confirm that categorically. And one of the strangest things was, in addition to the stab wounds, something had been carved into her torso. Now, this had been done with a sharp object, possibly the same object like a knife that was used to stab her. The 3 letters F-A-T were carved onto her skin. Were these initials? Was it meant to be the word fat? As yet, it's unknown. But the autopsy also determined that she had suffered blunt force injuries to her head and neck. This might have been due to being punched, or some other implement may have been used. Looking at Bowie's autopsy, it was determined that he had also died from multiple stab wounds. It is thought that he may have tried to attack the perpetrator of the crime. Samples were taken from around his mouth area and from under his claws, and a bite impression was also taken. It was hoped that if a suspect was ever caught, these might be instrumental in identifying the perpetrator of the terrible crime. To begin with, in the investigation, police were baffled. There was no apparent motive for this terrible crime. When examining Katie's body, her mobile phone was still with her, so it had not been stolen. She had about $5 in cash on her and a pair of earbuds, presumably those that she used with her phone. And so one might expect that the police would rule out robbery since her mobile phone was there and the small amount of cash. But it can't be ruled out completely. Due to the frenzied nature, or the apparent frenzied nature of the attack, the attacker may have just panicked and fled without taking items from Katie. A sexual assault kit was also performed on Katie, but as far as I can gather, the results of this were inconclusive and were never fully disclosed. At any rate, Atlanta police did not state that sexual assault was a clear motive for the attack. So let's look at what we do actually know. Police knew roughly the time that Katie Janness left Emma's place of work to walk Bowie to Piedmont Park. And averaging out the distance and the time they thought it might take her to walk to the entrance of the park, they determined that her murder took place sometime between about 12:20 and 1 o'clock when Emma left her work and went to find her. Now, this was confirmed in part by her last known sighting, which was the security camera that picked her up on the crossing, and this was at 12:07. The strange thing is, Katie was not captured on any other CCTV or security camera on her journey from Emma's place of work to the park entrance. Police would later state that many of the government cameras in the area were outdated and weren't working. Others may even have been turned off, possibly due to the same reason, but that this was nothing suspicious. There was one CCTV camera that was working, and this was focused on the entrance to the park where Katie and Bowie went in. Several people were caught on camera leaving the park close to the time of the killings, and police issued photos along with appeals to these potential witnesses to come forward. Police stressed that these individuals were not suspects. Eventually coming to a dead end, the Atlanta Police Department chose to involve the FBI, who also started their own investigation. A $10,000 reward was also offered for any information that would lead to the murder of Katie Janness and Bowie. In terms of possible suspects, as is often the case, some small-minded people immediately jumped to the conclusion that the perpetrator was close to home, and they started zeroing in on Emma Clark. Because of this, Emma started receiving horrible messages from some people who suspected her. It's reported that after Katie's death and when the accusation started, she was so alarmed that she even carried a gun because she'd also had death threats. But it must be emphasised that there is absolutely no record of Emma Clark leaving her place of work prior to 1 o'clock. And in the eyes of the police, she was not a suspect. The only other way that they thought Emma could have even been tenuously involved was that if there was some sort of issue between her and Katie and that she'd hired someone to carry out the murder. But it was considered highly unlikely. No evidence came to light to suggest that, and looking at the state of their relationship, which was particularly good, it didn't seem feasible. Turning to the details of the murder itself, Katie Janness was stabbed no less than 50 times. Now, in my mind, that suggests some form of frenzied killing. I have to ask myself, if the motive was robbery, would a person stick around long enough to stab the victim 50 times? Or would they just incapacitate the victim and run off with their belongings? Neither of those seems to be the case. And let's look at the circumstances of the murder. Stabbing a woman and her dog, even late at night in a public park, is a fairly, well, we'll call it a bold move. Terrible, but bold, not caring whether they were seen or not. And this very fact led police to believe that it was someone who may have known Katie Janness, known her enough to get close to her before the frenzied attack began. And so they began to ask themselves, who could be so angry with Katie that they would do something like this, and why? There was all sorts of conjecture. Could it have been someone that Katie knew from the past, possibly an ex-lover, or someone that she had rejected in some way, either romantically or otherwise? Perhaps even a co-worker who had some sort of angst with her. But it would have to be some sort of angst to kill her in such a frenzied fashion. Or that's what I think anyway. What's your opinion? Tell me down in the comments below and we can discuss it. And the police also looked at the fact that Katie, and sometimes Emma, regularly walked Bowie in this area, around the area of Piedmont Park and through the park itself. If the crime was perpetrated by someone close in her life, they probably would have known these details. And finally, the last kind of motive that the police looked at was just a random attack. Did Katie innocently walk Bowie into the park only to be confronted by someone who hadn't set out to kill her in particular, but was just out to kill someone? Perhaps they were psychologically compromised in some way. The fact that Katie was stabbed 50 times might lead you to believe that. The police also did consider the fact it might have been a hate crime. Katie and Emma were two ladies who were in a relationship. They were openly gay, and it may well be that someone took exception to this. So we're left with a number of unanswered questions. To date, here we are years later, and the murder of Katie Janness and the slaying of her faithful dog have not been solved. The murder brought terror and obviously a lot of upset to the local area. People were frightened to go out late at night in Piedmont Park, and the police mounted more horse patrols through the park to try and make people feel safe. But the questions that still arise are, in such a short period of time, that between Katie leaving Emma's place of work and arriving at the park, how did someone in such an open space where people could have been walking through the park manage to stab a woman in such a frenzied fashion and kill her dog without being seen? There seemed to be no witnesses. Nobody saw the murder, and nobody heard Bowie maybe having a go at the possible perpetrator, trying to protect his mistress. And after killing Katie, this cold, bold killer took the time to carve these strange 3 letters on her body, What motivated the perpetrator to do this, knowing full well that at any moment witnesses might come upon the scene and see what they were doing? And just looking at the local area, we're forced to question that in such a cosmopolitan modern city as Atlanta, Georgia, why was there such poor security? Why were so many CCTV and security cameras just not working? To this day, despite many repeated requests for information by the police, trying to keep the case alive, which incidentally they say is not closed, it's very much an active case, and also similar requests by the FBI, the case remains cold. We're no closer to knowing who killed Katie Janness on that night and who slew her faithful dog Bowie. It's hoped by many that in the future, any evidence in terms of traces of DNA and such that were taken from the corpse of Bowie might shed light on the murderer. But for the moment, all we have is speculation. Our thoughts and condolences go out to Emma and the family of Katie Janness and any friends who knew her. We hope one day that justice will be served. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And I'll thank you for watching.